north of the Caspian Sea, and it was a Jewish kingdom. Am I?
These were basically a people who were pagans. And some point in the 8th or maybe early ninth century, the king of the Khazars and the Khazars presumably converted to Judaism.
Dr. Lupovitch, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get too deep into the long history of the Jewish diaspora, let's address some basics here. For example, what's the difference between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews?
That's a great question. There's a couple differences. I think it comes down to one genealogy and the other culture. So Ashkenazic and Sephardic, first and foremost, these are terms that refer to different parts of the Jewish diaspora. So Ashkenaz is I would call it an old Jewish term or maybe a medieval Jewish term for Germany, like German Central
Oh,
Europe. And Sepharad means Spain. So both of these names appear in the Bible in a different context. And eventually Ashkenaz was understood by Jewish commentators of the Bible to be Germany and Sepharad to be Spain. So first and foremost, Ashkenazic and Sephardic refer to Jews who come from, in the case of Ashkenazic, they come from not specifically Germany, but let's say German, Eastern and Central Europe. So
that's a good
original
point
Ashkenaz.
because from time to time I speak to people of Jewish people, and they say they're Ashkenazi, and they're not German. They may be Polish. They may be Latvian.
Well, Ashkenazic Jews started in Germany, but beginning around the 1300s, there was a large-scale migration of German Jews eastward to Poland
Okay.
and to the Baltics and to Ukraine. So that large Jewish community that was in Eastern Europe, that was Russia, Western Russia, Poland, Ukraine, the Baltics until the Holocaust, that community was largely Ashkenazic because their ancestors had originally come from Germany.
Okay.
And so similarly with Sephardic Jews began in Spain, but there was also a Sephardic Jewish diaspora. So after the expulsion of Jews from Spain, Jews from Spain moved many places, including many parts of the Ottoman Empire. So there are large Sephardic communities in Iraq, in Turkey. Today, most Jews in Bulgaria are Sephardic. So
Oh,
first of all, it means where you come from. The other differences, there are cultural differences between what it means to be a Sephardic or an Ashkenazic Jew. So both, I would say 90% of what it is to be Jewish, certainly Jewish ritual, is the same. Keeping kosher is more or less the same. Observing the Sabbath is the same. The calendar is the same. The liturgy is mostly the same. But there are subtle little differences in liturgy and in practice. The main difference, though, is in a kind of outlook, because on the whole,
outlook. Okay.
Ashkenazic Jews, because Ashkenazic Judaism, as Ashkenazic communities began in a Christian context that was less hospitable to Jews, Ashkenazic Jews tended to be more, let's say, warier of the outside world and outside ideas than
Oh,
Sephardic Jews, because Sephardic Jews began in Spain at a time when Spain was much more hospitable to Jews. So I put it to you this way. Typically, if you walked into the home in the Middle Ages, let's say, if you walked into the home of an Ashkenazic Jew and you looked at the bookshelf, the books are going to be only Jewish books, the Bible, the Talmud, books written by rabbis, Jewish philosophy, Jewish literature, Jewish poetry. If you walked into the home of a Sephardic Jew, you would see all of those books, but you would also see books that weren't specifically Jewish books, philosophy, literature that wasn't Jewish. So Sephardic Jews tended to be a bit more worldly than Ashkenazi Jews. Not that Ashkenazi Jews were entirely closed off, but they were more closed off, more insular than Sephardic Jews.
Dr.
Now,
Lopovich, I started this podcast by telling you that let's get some basics out of the way. There's
sure.
nothing basic about what we're talking about. This could be a
No.
podcast onto its own. Wow, that's fascinating. In our initial talk, when we were chatting before we started the program, I mentioned to you that I had read a book relatively recently, like 2, 3 years ago, by Amos Oz, and in there, uh, I learned about Yiddish and how it sort of dominated the spoken language of the Jewish people over Hebrew. So how did this happen?
That's a great question. Well, it's two things. First of all, for much of the history of the diaspora, Hebrew was not the day-to-day spoken language of the Jews.
Yeah.
Hebrew was the language of prayer. Hebrew was the language of rabbinic discourse. But for a spoken language, Jews typically, in some cases, they spoke the vernacular language of the land, like most American Jews speak English. But more common, where Jews live, they created a Jewish dialect of the vernacular language. So Yiddish began as a Jewish dialect of medieval German written in Hebrew characters.
Oh, wow.
And
Um,
as Ashkenazic Jews moved to elsewhere, so for example, when Ashkenazic Jews moved from Germany to Poland, they brought Yiddish with them. And so Yiddish became the language of Polish Jews as well.
so would Sephardic Jews speak Yiddish?
No, Sephardic Jews, they had their own, they created a Jewish dialect of, well, I should back up and say that when Jews lived in Muslim Spain, they created a Jewish dialect of Arabic called Judeo-Arabic, which was Arabic written in Hebrew characters with some Jewish words put in. That one actually began in Baghdad. But later, when Jews lived in Christian Spain, they created a Jewish dialect of Spanish called Ladino. So
Oh, yes, I've heard.
Ladino
Yeah.
is Judeo-Spanish written in Hebrew characters. So Yiddish is for Ashkenazic Jews what Ladino is to Sephardic Jews.
This sounds, this practice of adopting a vernacular of their own religious language, in this case, Hebrew, is this particular to Judaism because, or particular to that time in Judaism? Because now, um, Jewish people don't, they just speak English here in America. And I apologize if my sort of question is way too simple and
No,
naive.
not at all.
And I'm wondering if Christians did that, create a Latinized version of their local dialect. I don't think that was the case, though, right?
Well, Latin became for Christians their language of prayer and
Yeah, but
language
they
of
kept their
knowledge.
local languages like English, French, or whatever Danish it was. But
The
this is
difference
really
is that,
fascinating. I'm trying to figure out
but the
why this.
difference is,
Go ahead,
yeah,
please.
the difference is that Christians were typically the majority.
Yeah,
Jews were
yeah.
always a very small minority. So for Jews, the choice was between embrace the language of the majority, there was some vernacular language. But the concern was, and this is a concern of a minority of people, you want to do things that preserve your own the integrity of your
Yeah.
community, that can help you preserve your identity as a small minority. And these Jewish dialects were one of the things that did that. Plus, they enabled Jews to live both in a larger world, so there was a connection to the vernacular language, but Jews have always had a deep love of Hebrew. So even a language like Yiddish, which is not Hebrew, or Ladino, which is not Hebrew, there are a lot of Hebrew words that have entered Yiddish and Ladino.
I
So, for
see. I see.
example,
That's
in Yiddish, the word for the Sabbath is not the German word for the Sabbath. The word for the Sabbath is Shabbos, which is an Ashkenazified version of the Hebrew word Shabbat. The Ashkenazic word for a holiday is Yontif, which is Ashkenazified version of Yom Tov in Hebrew.
that is fascinating. So they get to keep their community, preserve it by creating a language that's still tethered to Hebrew, which brings another, again, I apologize if this question is also way too simple. Why not just speak Hebrew then?
Great question. Hebrew was always defined as Lashon HaKodesh. It was a sacred tongue. It was for sacred purposes only, and sacred in Judaism meant prayer
Oh,
and the study of sacred text. And day-to-day life was deemed not sacred, but mundane. So even in ancient times, when Jews lived in Babylonia, they didn't speak Hebrew. They spoke a Jewish version of Aramaic. So probably not since biblical times when Jews lived in the land of Israel did Jews actually use Hebrew in day-to-day life, because it was eventually deemed as a sacred language. It's only in the modern world one of the things that Zionism as a secular Jewish identity introduced into the world was the revival of Hebrew as a language of day-to-day life. And part of that is that Zionists, being secular Jews, were not tethered to that notion of Hebrew as a sacred language. Hebrew became a national language instead.
Which I suppose meant that they had to create new words and terms.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But that in particular, there was the early Zionist thinker who really invented Hebrew as a modern language was a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda.
Uh-huh.
He became a Zionist very early on, already in 1890, and he was a believer that Zionism, it wasn't enough simply for Jews to leave the diaspora, create a sovereign homeland and a state, that Jewish culture had to be reinvented so that Jews who were losing interest in religion would still have a way to identify and have a full Jewish identity in life. And he believed that a modern spoken Hebrew would be the key to doing that. And so what he and his wife began doing in the 1890s is they began to speak only Hebrew to their children. And they were the only Jews anywhere in the world, even in the land of Israel, who were using Hebrew that way. And it was extraordinarily difficult. I mean, there was a time, that one of their children didn't speak for the first several years. And he and his wife were freaking out a little bit that this experiment was going to have disastrous consequences, but it eventually worked. And to answer your question, yes, they did have to invent new words. There was no Hebrew word for tomato or socks or train. They had to invent these words. Now, they had something to draw on because there were medieval dictionaries of Hebrew, but these were using older words, mostly words associated with scholarship and poetry and prayer. But yes, they did have to invent a lot of words.
That is fascinating. You shared with me the interest, actually the necessities more than an interest of preserving their own culture in Europe because they were the minority, which made me think of this kingdom in medieval era, the Khazars, which was in north of the Caspian Sea, and it was a Jewish kingdom. I'd love to learn this history.
Well, long story short, I mean the Khazar kingdom in Central Asia, like you say, north of the Caspian Sea. The story is that these were basically a people who were pagans. And some point in the 8th or maybe early 9th century, the king of the Khazars, and the Khazars presumably converted to Judaism. No one 100% exactly knows why, other than the fact that Judaism was an ancient religion. I guess it had its appeal that way. But there was this Jewish kingdom in the middle of Central Asia, in the Middle Ages, which sort of came out of nowhere. And eventually that they were discovered especially by Spanish Jews. There was a Spanish Jewish traveler whose name was Benjamin of Tudela, who
Uh-huh.
traveled all over the Jewish world and visited Jewish communities everywhere. And he had heard rumors about the Khazars, and he went to visit them. There was also a Spanish Jewish poet, philosopher named Yehuda Halevi, who wrote kind of a story about the king of the Khazars. He was writing this philosophical text. He's trying to explain, or he's trying to defend Judaism against its critics, but also explain why he felt Judaism was the superior religion. And so he made up a story called the Kuzari about the king of the Khazars, in which he imagined why would this pagan king choose Judaism. So it's a series of philosophical dialogues. And in these dialogues, the king of the Khazars, first he wants to become monotheistic. So first he's visited by a Christian, and then a Muslim, and then a philosopher, and then a Jew. It sounds almost like a joke. 4 philosophers go talk to the Khazar king.
Go into a bar, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And in each one of these dialogues, he asks questions, and he finds flaws in the arguments by the Christian, Muslim, and philosopher as to why theirs is the superior life. But it's the Jewish scholar who is able to convince the king of the Khazars about the truth, the rationality, the compassion of Judaism. And in Halevi's version, this is why the king of the Khazars becomes Jewish. But in reality, we don't know exactly why. We just know that he did. The kingdom lasted for a couple centuries. And then by
That's a
around the
long
year
time. Wow.
1200, it sort of disappeared. So it's sort of there and then it's not there. And no one knows exactly why.
Wow. Okay, let's
Yes.
let's peel away that history just a little bit. First of all, when you say it started in the 8th century, so this is somewhere in the 700s. Islam is a new religion. Christianity has become, for now, by then, 300-400 years, the official religion of the Byzantium Roman Empire, and then many parts of the world, most of southern Europe. Um, and this certain, was he a king or a head of a tribe? I use that word for the nomadic people of the steppes, right?
Right. Probably both. He was the
Probably
king,
both.
head of a tribe. I mean, that it's probably there was probably some, they were a tribe that had a certain territory. So I would say both.
So, ethnically speaking, what sort of people were they? Were they Turkic people?
Turkic, Central Asian, we don't 100% know that either, but they were associated with one of the Central Asian peoples today. I mean, they could have been who's ever in that region, the Kazakhs, Uzbeks, whoever are there. But something Turkic, something Central Asian.
Did they? Did they? Well, they're semi-nomadic people up there. So back then, so I'm not sure if this question applies, but let me ask it anyway. Did they create texts and scholarships that remain?
Not really.
That's just
No,
really wild.
what I've told you about them is most of what we know about them.
Wow.
What's known about the Khazars is mainly about in connection with their becoming Jewish. There's just not much more known about them.
Have any archaeological projects occurred over there, happen over there to dig and see? Or
Yeah,
I'm very fascinated by this.
yeah, I'm not really a maven on the archaeology of it.
Hmm.
But as far as I know, I don't think archaeologists they find, sometimes they find things that might be connected. There's
Yeah,
speculation, supposition, there's circumstantial evidence, but I don't think they've really found anything more definitive than the story we have so far.
okay.
And certainly they haven't found any more about why they became Jewish. We just know that they became Jewish.
That's really interesting. And there's no doubt about this. This is factual. This is like confirmed history.
As far as I know.
Yeah.
As far as I know.
Um, as I was preparing for my conversation with you, Dr. Lupovitch, I came across this extant, this current um, Jewish autonomous oblast that was created in the Soviet Union, Soviet era, and still exists. It's like
Yes.
the only other Jewish jurisdiction in the world than Israel, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is another very interesting story. Now, it takes place in a similar part of the world. It has nothing to do with the Khazars. This was a weird experiment or project by Stalin in the 30s in a region known as or a province known as Birobidzhan. So Stalin there was a large Jewish number of Jews who lived in the Soviet Union, many of whom had previously been Polish Jews or Russian Jews, and many of them by the 1930s had embraced parts or all of the ideology of the regime. These were Jews who were good Soviet citizens, but there was this notion that Stalin, unlike Lenin, who believed that national identity was an impediment to true identity, was something bourgeois. Stalin had a sense that some aspects of national culture could be preserved. I mean, him being Georgian, not Russian, was
Yeah,
a part
yeah.
of that. And so he did try to a limited extent to allow national minorities, including Jews, to cultivate some sense of national identity. And that eventually led to this project or this experiment. He took the province of Birobidzhan, which is on the border of China. It's very, very far,
Way out east.
way, way east. And he basically redefined this as an autonomous Jewish province. He said, Jews, go and create a Jewish province or a Jewish province of the Soviet Union in Birobidzhan. Now, the first thing you have to say is that Stalin wasn't only doing this out of any concern or interest in Jews. His primary concern was probably much more strategic, where he wanted on the border of China to have a population in an area which was largely unpopulated or underpopulated. He wanted a larger population of loyal citizens, of
Yeah,
people
yeah.
who were loyal to him as a buffer against any kind of Chinese expansion into the southeastern part of
But
the
when you
Soviet.
say loyal to him, I was just intrigued by this. This is in southern Siberia, way out there. I mean, did Russian Jewish people, Russian Jews, did they embrace this? Oh,
I mean, most did not.
okay.
That community, there were more than 1 million Soviet Jews. It was a large Jewish community.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe 20,000 went there. That's
Oh,
what I say.
that's
This was an
minuscule.
experiment,
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
a
yeah.
little bit more, but it's not. It's in the tens of thousands.
Yeah.
Some went. They were offered land. They were offered, a, a good life. They were basically, if you wanted to get away from the government and not be hassled, you were far from Moscow and St. Petersburg. You were living in an area that was basically the Wild West. It was way out there, but it was also the promise of, he said, Jews who live there, Soviet Jews who go and live there, you can basically run your own affairs. And the language of this province was going to be Yiddish, because
Oh,
Yiddish already in the Soviet Union was one of the national languages that was allowed under in the Soviet Union. So, for example, Hebrew in the Soviet Union was largely not allowed. Hebrew was considered a national language. Zionism as a movement was not allowed in the Soviet Union. It was a national movement. Um,
wow.
but Yiddish was considered to be the local identity, and it was considered to be compatible with the Soviet identity. So even a decade or more before Birobidzhan, Soviet Jews were cultivating a kind of Yiddish culture. It was secular Jewish culture in Yiddish, but oriented around the ideas of being a Soviet citizen. So it was basically, the goal was to teach Soviet Jews what it meant to be a Soviet citizen, or the way one person described it as, to bring the ideology of the Soviet Union to the Jewish street. And since most Soviet Jews still spoke Yiddish, in addition to or only, and didn't speak Russian, Yiddish was a great way to reach a lot of Jews. And so for Yiddish-speaking Jews who wanted a sense of Jewish agency, but were not interested in Zionism, they could go to Birobidzhan and be part of this weird Jewish autonomy experiment all the way in Birobidzhan.
And still exists.
It still exists. I mean, it
It's
still
just,
exists. The signs are still in Yiddish. I wouldn't say it's anything terribly significant
yeah,
anymore.
yeah.
I mean, as national Jewish movements go, this one was much more a footnote, certainly
Yeah,
compared to
yeah,
Soviet.
and I perceive it as such. It was just really interesting when I stumbled across it.
It's an interesting little story
Yeah,
for sure.
and we'll be back after a short break to talk about Jewish diaspora in Europe. We'll be right back.